So this is a lap book that we did on marine biology. We had lots of fun doing lots of excursions and different things. The front cover was actually a canvas that Cece painted, which we just took a copy of and made into the front cover. And this was just a little bit of Word document, getting her to play around with the computer and learn how to use that. All right, on our first page we looked at what are producers and consumers. So she learned that plants are producers, and she drew a little diagram, a little bit about how plants turn the sun's energy into food by photosynthesis. So this was a very simple diagram of photosynthesis that she drew. And then that animals are consumers. We did a very simple food web, looking at herbivores and carnivores and the meaning of omnivores. And then we had a little look at some other relationships, such as predator and prey, parasite and host, and symbiosis. And there are wonderful examples in the ocean of those sorts of things. When we open it up, we were learning about nouns and adjectives and verbs. So we just used some little fish, cut them out, and she wrote down examples of some adjectives to do with the ocean, and some adverbs, some verbs describing lots of different things that mostly the fish do, and then some nouns from the ocean. Did you know just some little facts that she found out that she found interesting, and she popped those in. This was just a birthday card she was given that was in the theme, but together with some friends she wrote a poem about the coral reef, which they illustrated and we typed up. So this is just a poem that we found, and she highlighted all the different adjectives and pronouns, adverbs, all the different parts of the English language that I wanted her to learn. Inside this one is just a very simple poem that she wrote, a small short poem. Over here we started to look at classification, starting with all of God's creation and dividing it into living and non-living, and then a little description of the characteristics of living things and some examples of non-living things, so the abiotic environment. Within the living things we then looked at plants and animals, plants being producers and animals being consumers. And then within animals we looked at invertebrates and vertebrates and some examples of each. We did a little experiment about buoyancy, looking at things that float, things that sink. And then we tried an egg in some fresh water and saw that it sunk. We put egg in salt water and discovered that it floated. And then this is a fun experiment to do. Put some salt water in a glass and then put some coloured fresh water, very carefully pour it on top, and then put your fresh egg in and see where it floats. And it comes up very nicely, floating just above the salt water, sitting in the fresh water. So it sinks in the fresh water, but it floats in the salt water. So it sits between the division of the two. And depending on the child, they can explain why that is, because the salt water is more dense, because it has salt dissolved within the molecules of the water. And we took the opportunity to learn the oceans of the world, just a little map there. And this is a photo of her and her friend doing a little experiment with some plasticine, seeing how many coins they were able to carry within their little, well, they discovered they needed to make a boat shape. And so we talked about why that is. This next page, being a science teacher, I got a little carried away with all the different classes of invertebrates and vertebrates. So we looked at the vertebrates, fish and birds, reptiles and mammals that live in the ocean, and then we looked at some of the invertebrates. So under each of these, gave Cece an opportunity to do a little bit of drawing and discover some of the types of fish that she might find, some of the birds that live in the ocean, some reptiles that live in the ocean. She was doing a little bit of cartooning at the time. She had a bit of fun drawing those. And some mammals that live in the ocean or near the ocean. Going through the invertebrates, she learnt about sponges and coelentrates, so the jellyfish and the sea anemones. Nemo is always a good example. a good movie to watch whilst you're doing this sort of a project. Some different worms that live in the ocean, and some of them are really very beautiful. Lovely nature shows that you can watch whilst doing this sort of a topic as well. Echinoderms, including starfish or sea stars, and the fact that starfish aren't fish at all, because fish are actually vertebrates. Sea urchins and sea cucumbers all belong together, and then the mollusks, where we get all the beautiful shells that we find at the beach. So going for a walk along the beach and collecting shells is always fun, but it also includes the cephalopods, the octopi and squid and cuttlefish. And then there are the arthropods, many of whom also live in the ocean, including crabs, lobsters and prawns. We like to get together with other homeschooling friends, and we had everybody do a little talk. We did a talk on one vertebrate and one invertebrate each. So Cece decided to look at the emperor penguin as her vertebrate. So this is where we include some English in regards to she needed to research it. She took notes. She then drafted her talk, and then we edited it and refined it, and then finally she presented her talk to her friends. So that's all about her penguins, her notes. What I found really useful was for her to actually write notes as she read different books that she got out of the library. We then cut up those notes into sentences, which she stuck together. So these are all pieces of paper that we've cut out from a copy of that, which she then grouped together into similar topics so that she could see how each paragraph were about related information. And that's how she put together her talk. And then we looked at how talks are always more interesting if there's something to look at. So she dressed up as a little fairy penguin. Sorry, emperor penguin. Right, environmental issues are always important, so we include that wherever we can. So we looked at polar ice. So why is it important? What's happening to it, in that it's melting, and how can we help? So how do we contribute to the increasing temperatures on the Earth? Took the opportunity to also look at states of matter, so solid, liquids and gases. Since we're looking at the ocean, we looked at the water cycle. So a very simple diagram of the water cycle, and then we did a whole bunch of experiments that helped her understand some of this terminology, evaporation and condensation and precipitation. So to look at evaporation, a really fun experiment, a very simple write-up set up clearly for her, where she just has to write a title, the procedure, simple step-by-step procedure, some observations of what she saw, and a conclusion. And with observations, it's always great to have a diagram. So I get her to fill in a diagram. So this was where we put boiling water into a tin, and because it's evaporating quickly, because it's hot, the lid of the Milo tin pops up. A lot of fun to do. One on condensation, where we filled up a tin with water and put it in the freezer overnight, and then we left it out on the bench, and we could see how the water vapour in the air condensed all on the outside of the tin. Then I wanted her to observe how water expands as it freezes. So we put a container with a mark, a line on the jar, and put that in the freezer. And we could see that once it was frozen, the level of the ice was higher than the water level was when we put it in. And then the fact that the ice took up more space than the water meant that it was less dense, which meant that when you put ice in water, it actually floats. And so we did that and observed that ice does float, which you can then relate to icebergs in the ocean and how they can float, and how so much of an iceberg is actually below the level of the water. We then looked at the freezing of salt water and how that salt water doesn't freeze as easily as fresh water. So we had observations after 30 minutes in the freezer, an hour and 2 hours, and she looked at the ice cubes, they were just ice cubes, of fresh water and of salt water. And so after 2 hours, the salt water still hadn't frozen, but even after 1 hour, the fresh water had frozen. So she was able to observe that. We also did a simple evaporating experiment where we put some salt water into an oil burner, just with a tea light underneath, so that we could evaporate the water off and leave behind the salt crystals. So another example of evaporation. And then a very simple experiment for transpiration is to put a plastic bag, tie it around the leaves of some plants and see how water actually condenses inside the bag, because water is being transported up the plant and coming out of the leaves, which is the process of transpiration. Now this section of our lap book was a bit of fun. We decided to make a little diorama. Not sure if you can see that from there. Now this is a diorama that she made. She had a favourite book called I Spy, and she decided that she wanted to do a three-dimensional I Spy in the coral reef. So she listed some different things that you'd find in the coral reef, and then she painted a background. Obviously I helped her make the three-dimensional part so that things would pop up. So I drew some coral reef and painted that, and then found some different pictures and stuck them on, and also made some pieces out of shrinky dink. That's a plastic substance that you can draw and then put in the oven, and it shrinks and becomes quite thick. And yeah, so I had a lot of fun making that. Right, and the last page of our lap book, I always have a pocket on the back of our lap book where I put different things that we might have done. So in here, when I was introducing it, I wanted to see that God's creation, this was just a sheet that I did for her so she could see the overview, that we start with all of God's creation. Within that we have non-living and living, and the sun's energy comes into the plants, which turn into food, and then the animals eat the plants. So we've got producers and consumers. So this is very much the science teacher coming out in me. And then within the consumers we looked at some vertebrates, the different types, and the invertebrates. This is a draft of a story that Cece wrote. Each chapter she wrote as a draft. We'd then go through and edit it together, and then she put it together into a little book. And the summary of her story is that Hammy is a sweet-lipped fish that lives in the Yellow Sea off the coast of China. One day a ship sinks and starts to spread oil everywhere. Will Hammy and his friends be able to block the pipe before all the homes of the animals of the ocean are destroyed? Join Hammy on a wonderful adventure of meeting new friends, being held captive, and working as a team. That was Cece's story that she wrote. And we went on an excursion with some friends to a local touch pool where we learnt all sorts of things, and I think these are some of the worksheets that we picked up from there. And we even went to a puppet show at the Spare Parts Puppet Theatre, which was to do with Blueback, a Great Big Fish, a book written by Tim Winton. So, an example of what you can do with a lap book. It's open up, you just leave it up to the imagination. There is so much you can do. Hope you have fun. If you found this helpful, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. For more homeschooling ideas, particularly in science, visit us, that's Sue and Cece, at educationaltrend.com.au, where you can sign up for our homeschooling newsletter or try out our online secondary science classes. And if you are a Facebook user, then please like our Facebook page. You can find that by searching @Science with Sue and Cece. Thanks so much.